First and foremost, we are not experts on the Northern Triangle. We are primarily communication scholars, and we approach the challenge of Northern Triangle migration as a theoretical challenge. The second thing is to point out that our purpose here is to expand your perspective and imaginings on the issue of Northern Triangle migration as an offered assist to the knowledge and advantages that you already have on the issue. So let me take a 10,000-foot view and zoom us out here for a second before getting into details. Over 79 million human beings are displaced globally. Over 26 million are defined as refugees, and entire regions of our planet are labeled with terms indicative of their lack of prosperity. Mass irregular migration is historic and a sincere challenge to the systems of order that we have inherited. As a species, we're hardwired by evolution, identity, and sense of purpose to look within the structures we know when trying to solve a problem or explain the unknown. That is, we rely on what has already proven successful for us to make sense of the world rather than seeking out new information that has so far been unnecessary for our survival and that may waste precious time and resources to acquire. As a simple illustration of this, stop for a moment and try to imagine what a utopian world might look like. And then take a moment to imagine the collapse of the US government or the collapse of the global order into some kind of dystopian nightmare. And you'll find that it's easier to imagine the hellscape of global collapse than it is to imagine something workably cooperative. And that's because we think in terms evolutionarily attuned to system protection. We can see the known breaking, but not so much do so well in the way of imagining outside of its confines. The developed global system of economic trade, information sharing, criminality, and political diplomacy is incredibly complicated. The challenge of globalization is that its key elements, think here nation states, for example, and its key functions, namely the securing of resources, are not necessarily designed for the complexity of interactions allowed by advances in technology and demanded by the explosive growth in the human population. The complexity of our global system has created a long list of interlinked niche tasks responsible for maintaining status quos, and those of particular importance to migration revolve around matters of exclusion. When a challenge such as mass migration hits our interconnected global system simultaneously at multiple levels, assessing all of the impacts is simply impossible. Therefore, narrowing down the primary themes all these touch points have in common to one another is valuable and avoids the burden of chasing causation. Aligning various vantage points or orbits of perspective around themes creates a map-like layout of stories, here helping the challenge of migration to be seen as a presently unfolding organic event and giving us more to imagine possibilities from. The idea is that the stories we tell about events presents a framework of understanding representative of worldview, virtue, and sense of purpose. By coalescing stories from different vantages on the same topic, a larger image unfolds where alignments and misalignments of interest can be more clearly seen and imagined. The vantages offered in this work come from 40 interviews with migrants, law enforcement officers, journalists, filmmakers, policy experts, vocational workers, shelter workers, migration lawyers, missionaries, academics, and nonprofits. People from the Northern Triangle region, people from the US, people in the Ivory Tower, and people who put their lives very much at risk every day on the ground. The work also examines 50,000 plus news media articles from the US, Mexico, and the Northern Triangle going back 20 years, as well as over 50 policy briefings detailing the challenges and possible solutions to mass irregular migration. While differing catalysts and provocations, most often rooted in economic resource extraction and widening social power imbalances, are most often blamed for the failures of our emergent global society to address the mounting challenges of migration. The purpose here is to highlight the non-causal element of perspective in the moment by examining the stories told across a larger interconnected system. Next slide. Literature on migration from the Northern Triangle, and that is El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, argues migrants have moved to the United States in droves since the 1990s. A variety of push factors escalated this movement over the past 5 years. In particular, the region has been plagued by extreme violence, governmental corruption, and poverty. Organized crime has run rampant due to a corrupt political system or corrupt political systems. Many people have or know someone who has experienced kidnapping, extortion, or sexual violence. There's the regular recruiting of young men from these areas into gangs. And if the targeted young men refuse to join, their families are often threatened with violence or there's violence committed against them. And not only are young men targeted, but gender-based violence directed towards young women is also very prevalent. Gangs have thrived because the region is geographically situated to serve as a corridor of drug movement between South and North Americas. The corrupt political systems of the region fail to address these patterns of organized violence, accelerating the region's overall decline. Weak governmental infrastructure allows violence to run rampant throughout the Northern Triangle. Government and local law officials are often complicit, resulting in low confidence levels in their abilities. Past studies attribute a lack of economic and educational opportunities to the regional decline, and joining in gangs is often a means to support families financially due to few employment options in the community. A key industry in decline is coffee production. Thousands of residents in the Northern Triangle depend on the coffee industry for their income. However, droughts, crop disease, and a lack of accessible land have left thousands without income. The entire area is marked by what is described in literature as cyclical violence and symptoms of state collapse. Our work here tries to bridge the gaps in these stories being told about migration coming from the Northern Triangle across a wide variety of stakeholders and media, recognizing that no one stakeholder or perspective contains a complete objective truth concerning the issue, and believing that a collage of perspectives making sense of Northern Triangle migration would offer a more complete composite sketch of the larger unfolding event. We relied heavily on narrative theory to guide our assessments of stories. Narrative theory offers ways to categorize and thematicize stories around elements such as actor, scene, instruments of power, purpose, as well as things like tone, the rise and fall of action, and shift in focus. As communication scholars have pointed out, human beings make sense of their world not through logical argument, but through the stories we tell ourselves about others and ourselves, with an emerging body of literature examining how such narratives impact and constrain policymaking and implementation. As such, to help DHS understand the complexity of migration-related policy, we examine how Northern Triangle, Mexico, and the U.S. audiences and their policymakers narratively converge and at times diverge from each other, as well as areas of opportunity for policy coordination in pursuit of common action. We'll turn it over to Dr. Robert Hink now to speak more, and you can move on to slide 3.
Hello, everyone. I'm on my phone right now. It seems like my Teams from my computer isn't working, so hopefully you all can hear me and see me. If not, I don't know, do something to signal that everything's not going well. But as Sky alluded to, our project employed a mixed method design for this whole study here. Specifically, we blended perspectives from media systems, policy briefs, and personal stories from stakeholders on the ground dealing with Central American and Northern Triangle migration in particular. And so using these different methodologies, we're able to layer the different data sets to assess and organize and make sense of how these narratives are unfolding and what implications this holds for DHS and how we can improve some of our perspectives on understanding this very tough, difficult problem here. Now, originally, our project design called for site visits and focus groups as part of our methodology, but of course, COVID-19 related travel restrictions prevented this. Nonetheless, we were still able to actually contact and conduct over 40 open-ended stakeholder interviews. We then qualitatively organized that data into the narrative themes. And those groups, those stakeholders included people from migrants, shelter workers, policy experts, lawyers, journalists, law enforcement, academics, and vocational trainers. Second set of data and analysis that we utilized was a qualitative content analysis of policy briefs. We analyzed 57 different briefs from 20 different organizations from 2015 to 2020. Again, trying to find the common ways that these briefs defined the problems, described what solutions were working and not working in order to kind of graph that onto our overall findings. And then third, we analyzed a lot of news articles. Specifically, we looked at over 50,000 news articles from Mexican, Northern Triangle, and U.S. media systems. We analyzed 7 different Mexican news sources, 9 from the Northern Triangle, and 3 from the United States, like the Washington Post, New York Times, and Wall Street Journal. We then compared how these three different national media systems reported broadly about migration, and we did so over a 20-year span, beginning in 1999 up until 2019, in which we broke down this coverage into 4 different periods as they related to major U.S. immigration policy discussed in Congress and the White House. And so we had about 27,000 articles from the US, over 17,000 from Mexico, over 8,000 from the Northern Triangle. And in terms of how we actually analyze this or use our narrative approach, we first began by examining the broad structure of media reports regarding migration by training our own AI algorithm. And so this includes classifications regarding discussions on the region of migrant origination, perceptions regarding which countries are responsible for managing the issues associated with migration, whose voices were reported within those articles, such as government agencies, migrant stories, aid groups, as well as things like migrant emotions and reasons for migration, and elements covering policies and the overall migratory journey. Then to place this discussion into narrative context, we also employed various topic modeling algorithms that then clustered these stories again by time period and country. We took the exemplar articles from these different topic modeling clusters and then synthesized those to compare how the different narrative themes shifted again by both media system or country, but also by time. And then finally, we went one step deeper in our analysis by using text mining software to map out the constellation of terms that form the dominant actors, agents, context or scene, instruments, and purposes of goals within these articles, again, comparing how these narratives shifted over time and again by country, specifically trying to identify where were those big divergences occurring, what were driving those, or what part of the narrative elements were driving those, and where were commonalities potentially there. So if you turn to the next slide, slide 4, I will briefly go over some of our findings here. So in general, the analysis of the data collected in our report paints this narrative portrait of Northern Triangle migration as eclipsing traditional U.S. understandings of migration as coming from Mexican migrants or day laborers seeking temporary work to send back as remittances to send their families. Instead, we get this rise of Northern Triangle migration, which includes this demographic shift of migrants being primarily young men to now include women and children. And all of this demographic shift ends up being incentivized by gang and political violence, economic inequality, widespread corruption, in part facilitated in transactions and stemming from dangerous criminal smuggling networks who now profit from the stringent enforcement of government policies aimed to deter migration. More specifically, to dive into some of our key narrative divergences and convergences here, I'll break down some of our findings by the 5 different elements of how we kind of understand narratives here. So the first is understanding the scene in which migration is occurring. And this scene is largely undisputed among the 3 different media systems that we looked at, the 3 different societies here. Over the past 2 decades, we see increasing numbers of migrants embarking on the journey to the U.S. In doing so, they suffer from significant humanitarian abuses, violence, family separation, and loss of life. Furthermore, upon reaching the U.S. border, U.S. immigration officials are all reported as being overwhelmed, understaffed, and ill-equipped, lacking the time and resources to handle this large volume of people and their needs, which then drives these perceptions and exasperating the reality of migrants being treated in an undignified and inhumane manner. In other words, there's a convergence among the U.S. Northern Triangle Mexican audiences regarding the danger of migration, and yet, nonetheless, this threat of violence does little to deter Northern Triangle migrants, as their home conditions are viewed as more dangerous than embarking on the journey itself. However, one key point of divergence in the scene of migration comes from U.S. reports. Specifically, U.S. media and state policy tends to de-emphasize or ignore discussions of the root causes of migration, that is, the strong desire or need for migrants to escape this poverty and violence experience within their country of origin. This then feeds into the next part here. The second narrative element here focuses on the actions. And so what we see is that there are numerous and frequent reports that highlight the actions that are happening as part of this narrative of migration. And again, we see a lot of commonalities across stakeholders and media systems about what these acts look like. For instance, these acts include migrants leaving their homes to travel to the U.S. in particular, the experiences migrants face when they're detained, when they're deported, when they're separated, violence being committed against them on their journey. And unfortunately, these reported acts seemingly dominate the narratives on migration. That is, attention's placed on the acts, less so than the scene and other narrative elements here, with the discussions in the U.S. in particular focused on deterrent actions and enforcement mechanisms. So these coalesce into this action-oriented narrative that draws attention to particular episodes while obscuring the longer-term consequences and the deeper causes of irregular migration. So then third, if we look at the agents that are included in this narrative, we see across U.S., Mexican, and Northern Triangle media that immigration officials from all three countries are frequently talked about, especially as they implement the acts that were just described above. We also see, though, that only recently does the U.S. media system start to realize that Northern Triangle migrants are their primary agents embarking on this migratory journey. That is, Mexican and Northern Triangle media were both more quickly to pick up on this demographic shift and relate that to the broader purposes of migration, whereas the U.S. was a little bit slower to see this shift, again, thinking more traditionally about Mexican migrants coming here and focusing more on the laborer aspects here, instead of seeing this new issue that's kind of then resulted in a little bit less alacrity in terms of dealing with this new context of migration arising from women and children, which then blurs our clear-cut categorizations and how we make sense of how to handle migration by bringing in some more of these family and human dimensions here. So other emerging agents include the rise, though, of criminal organizations as time period goes on, specifically drug cartels, and the importance of how these drug cartels then start to financially profit and monopolize the routes through Mexico into the U.S., as well as other illegal entry points into the U.S. And all of this arises as ways to circumvent how the U.S. has actually stepped up on its border. And so this then leads importantly into the fourth and largest divergence that we see when we start to understand this narrative of migration, specifically the elements of the instruments by which migration is happening, and then the larger motives that are driving it. So this largest divergence comes from how the U.S., Mexican, Northern Triangle societies understand the underlying push-pull factors leading migrants to come to the U.S., and specifically the instruments and purposes in which they do so. So there's a lack of understanding regarding U.S. migration policies that block migrant entry within Northern Triangle and Mexican discussions, as well as, though, U.S. discourse on migration, instead focusing increasingly on solidifying discussions of border security. So Northern Triangle and Mexican discourses instead emphasize the humanitarian need to seek a better life, including economic opportunity, as well as a life free from overt violence from the countries of origin and experiences that they're going through. This then is fundamentally different from the U.S.'s focus and discourse on border security, which then leads to two fundamentally different narrative purposes or goals that then drive this misunderstanding between U.S. Northern Triangle and Mexican actors, in addition to then the reasons or underlying purposes of U.S. policy, specifically in terms of deterring some of these migratory efforts. Now, a major implication comes from the fact that although Mexican and Northern Triangle audiences to some extent agree that the United States or any country has the right to protect one's border, the U.S.'s preoccupation, or at least the narrative here about border security, ends up seen or being perceived by the other, by Northern Triangle and Mexican audiences as inappropriately criminalizing migration. This then ignores the plight of migrants while also empowering criminal organizations. What I mean by this in the latter part here is a common plot line is that the U.S. border enforcement policies do work. That is, Northern Triangle and Mexican media do emphasize how it is far harder to enter the United States because of this increased border security. However, this has then made entry more challenging, but in doing so has not deterred migrants from coming. Instead, it's merely pushed migrants into taking increasingly dangerous and illegal pathways to reach the United States. In other words, this underlining value claim within U.S. narratives, that is, border security, has little impact on Northern Triangle's migrants' underlining value or motive for migration, that is, escaping the perils of living in the country they're leaving and the willingness to risk their lives in order to have better opportunities in the United States. And so you can see how this then narrative ends up feeding and exacerbating some of the issues, including some divergences among these three societies in terms of how we're understanding these things. So while migrants are not necessarily seen as criminals themselves, the process of migration now inherently involves close contact with criminal organizations, human smugglers, and life-threatening circumstances, as migrants are merely pushed further underground in their efforts to circumvent more effective U.S. securing of the border. This relational linkage then of migration and migrants to the harrowing criminal enterprises also has a second unintended consequence of helping fuel demonizing rhetoric in the United States, which then negatively impacts support for U.S. policies aimed at humanitarian relief. And so U.S. actions and officials end up being described as treating migrants in more undignified manners, robbing migrants of their humanity. And so likewise, we see this negative perception or lack of trust from Northern Triangle and Mexican audiences, as well as some stakeholders regarding DHS officials and their work with the migrant communities. Many of the potential interviews that we contacted for the study refused to participate, citing distrust and disgust with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security as part of their reasoning. Again, seeing how they, even the interviews kind of wrap into these narratives of distrust and the different moral underpinnings and purposes of how we talk about these things. So despite these grim presentations of migration and its processes, there are tangible actions U.S. officials can take to reframe this broader narratives concerning Northern Triangle migration around some longer-term solutions and new visions here. Our data shows that the U.S. has significant capacity for moral leadership and resources to enact change in more efficacious manners, specifically by helping coordinate civil society actors in combating corruption and in Mexico and Northern Triangle governments. In sum, we do see a commonality across the data sets that there is a desire to stem the destabilizing effects of migration. Societies at their core strive to provide conditions for individuals to live prosperous lives and to avoid inhumane treatment of those seeking prosperity. Stories that frame migratory acts as illegal or focused on U.S. deterrence policies have the potential to spiral into conflict-laden binaries. Such presentations conflate criminality and migration in ways that neglect Northern Triangle and Mexican perspectives on U.S. policies and push antagonistic frames of migrants as illegal, unwanted, and burdensome to societies. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Asia to discuss some of the deliverables and other steps that can be taken.
Next slide. All right, so I'll talk a little bit about our deliverables. So beyond the final report, our project included the artificial intelligence platform that allowed searchable interface to assess the gathered media data and assess any of the relationship that exists within this data. We have one academic article under review currently from the project fundings, and we're already excited to say that we have started the work on the book manuscript as well. We're in the process of publicizing the findings. You had seen the video that opened up this session, for example. We also just finished recording of the podcast as part of the In Vivo Between the Data series. And this podcast highlights projects that include innovative ways of assessing qualitative data for more broader scientific community. Next slide. All right. So the findings from our study suggest the following narrative bridges that may be helpful in better aligning discussions of migration from the Northern Triangle across various stakeholders. First, we can focus on empowering messages that explain how U.S. policies address the root causes of migration. This can be accomplished through outlining push and pull factors that we talked about, such as violence, instability, corruption, degraded government capacity, and various economic issues that arise. It is very clear that vocal stances against corruption from US leaders are seen as important within these communities. We can also describe how policies can create pockets of stabilities across NT and Mexico, particularly indigenous empowerment or in cooperative partnership with nonprofits and NGOs on the ground can be emphasized. Most importantly, it is important to recognize that current US policies and restrictions incentivize criminal cartel control of human smuggling to the US, which Robert has touched upon, and that has weakened anti-corruption efforts in the Northern Triangle and eroded confidence in the cooperative solutions. Second, reclaiming a moral high ground through transcendent narratives of multilateral cooperation is another one of those opportunities. US rhetoric on migration can be adjusted to describe humanitarian efforts, both at the border and in the transit origin countries, rather than focusing just on the criminality and the desperate acts of the migrants. It is critical to recognize that US security-based rhetoric emphasizing restrictions and deterrence efforts only further allows human smugglers and cartels to spread the disinformation that creates surges in crossing attempts. Rather, we can be presenting the issue of migration as an international opportunity for combating corruption and various criminal organizations that are involved. This can be achieved through the use of rhetoric that ingratiates active regional and international NGOs, as well as other states that are capable of this burden sharing. And some examples that come to mind are Canada, Costa Rica, Panama, for example. Third, there is an opportunity to recharacterize migrants and avoid language that criminalizes migration. This can be achieved through humanizing migrants by describing their plight as one in search of basic human needs, basic human dignity, and the safety. Another option is capitalizing on terminology that is already meaningful within these migrant communities. For example, one term that stuck across the stakeholder interviews was the term New American, and that refers to migrants to the US. This reframing of migration can be achieved through describing migration's historical roots and recognizing that it is a natural occurring cyclical human phenomenon. And this natural phenomenon cannot be altered by the defensive solutions alone. So this tactic may reduce fear of migrants. Another tactic that can be helpful in reducing this fear is highlighting the contributions and entrepreneurial initiatives of migrants and migrant communities, both in the US and the transit countries. Fourth, there is clear need to provide narrative messages that clarify the US migration process. So how can we accomplish that? Well, one way to reframe the US immigration process is transparent, rule of law approach, emphasizing fairness. We heard it over and over again throughout the interviews that migrants are misinformed and woefully underprepared when seeking asylum. The situation results in further case backlogs, overrun detention facilities, and it certainly incentivizes the use of the human smugglers. By explaining asylum rules and demonstrating partnerships with civil society actors, multilateral institutions already aiding asylum seekers, there is clear opportunity to mitigate these problems and turn the illegal immigration in a legal process. So what are some of the specific ways to do it? Can be explain the adjudication process in ways that individuals can prepare and facilitate the proof of their identity. It can be opening pathways for asylum seekers to receive explanation of the process and to present their case for asylum in their native language. It can be recognizing that a lack of trained social workers, along with underfunded and overcrowded U.S. detention facilities, really undermine the very faith in pursuing legal migration process and asylum seeking. Most importantly, we need to recognize that U.S. information campaigns must continually evolve to reflect the dynamic nature of the migration process. Migrants focus largely on positive exemplars, and inconsistent and unclear U.S. policy foster false hopes. Instead, information campaigns explaining qualification for asylum can provide transparencies and set realistic expectations. So there are a few more opportunities I would like to mention. As you're aware, the issue of migration is a highly politicized issue in the US, and the solution might lie in avoiding such politicization. Emotionally charged terms, demonizing or criminalizing migrants, polarizes US society and draws attention to actions that focus on deterring migration rather than addressing the roots and causes and associated humanitarian issues of the migration. As an example, narrative themes promoting Fortress America mentality, or migrants as criminals, or the migrants are stealing the US jobs, all of this present wedge issues undermining US border enforcement ability to enact policies and make investments addressing the root causes of migrations. Finally, the US has an ability to demonstrate efforts to help those who are already here. A few opportunities come to mind. We can foster greater appreciation for migrants within the US. We can address US vocational and documentation-oriented barriers that marginalize migrants or force them into the shadows of society. And here's just a few of the trivial examples that we've encountered. Getting a driver's license or opening a bank account stood out within the interviews that we have conducted as holding significant meaning for migrants. Additionally, we can create discussions that weave community partners together with migrants to offer localized vocational training and the opportunities. It turns out that many stakeholders point out to the tremendous good work that's going on in Mexico and Northern Triangle by nonprofits, NGOs, other organizations, and there's truly a need for a hub or even various hubs that are connecting them together. Our interview data and media reports both suggest that migrants face difficulties when assimilating in the US. So many existing vocational centers already offer ways of assessing their skills, matching them to the, and really matching them to the skills of the communities. There are certainly many successful models of integration, and more centers can be created and even expanded, maybe perhaps in other areas. Next slide, please.
Okay, so to close, I would just like to reiterate that how a problem is understood or how a situation is defined implicates the conceivable solutions open for us to pursue. And in this sense, how we talk about migration can over time reorient actions and outcomes. By considering the perspectives of others in relation to one's own, we open up this possibility for change and outline narrative perspectives of how US, Northern Triangle, and Mexican audience make sense of transnational migration from the Northern Triangle, emphasizes the communicative dynamics of migration policies, offering a broad picture from which to begin comprehending this massive scope. Having such a perspective is a key step towards shifting how US agencies talk about migration, both in external messages as well as in formulating policies that can enable meaningful cooperative solutions. In closing, we'd like to thank, again, DHS and BTI for sponsoring the project, as well as to our MESA students who put in so much time over the last year. For those of you who are unfamiliar, MESA is an interdisciplinary research group. We're housed at Oklahoma State and area universities. You can check out our website for more information on any of these projects. Email us any in-depth questions you might have. And